The Federal Reserve is preparing for a meeting next week where it will decide how to adjust interest rates. Microsoft invests billions of dollars in the startup behind a dystopian chatbot that writes prose mimicking human speech. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has proposed judicial reforms to Israel's Supreme Court after the court controversially blocked one of Netanyahu's ministerial appointments. And for our timeless topic of the day, we will discuss what the use or disuse of certain words in America over time reveals about our thoughts and behavior. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey friends, it is Wednesday, January 25th, 2022, and let's start out by talking about the news that you have to know today. And this first story is about the Fed, which is always riveting to talk about the Fed. In all seriousness, though, it actually is interesting what the Fed is pursuing here. And even if it's not interesting, quite frankly, it's something that we need to know about. Because we are at a place right now in the United States where large swaths of elected officials simply do not know or understand this basic stuff. I can promise you, if you asked President Biden to explain the Federal Reserve and interest rates, he would look at you and respond, "I don't know, man." So let's get into it here. The Fed is having its first meeting of the year next week on January 31st and February 1st, where they will decide how to adjust interest rates. As background, the Federal Reserve is the central banking system of the United States that was signed into law under President Woodrow Wilson in 1913. It is comprised of a group of people appointed by the President of the United States, and they are tasked to uphold the Fed's dual mandate, which is number one, to keep unemployment low, and number two, to keep prices stable. Because inflation right now is so high, it's about 8.1 or 8.2% right now, and there are so many layoffs. Spotify, for instance, just announced yesterday that it's laying off 600 employees, or 6% of its workforce. Obviously, many people know that Goldman Sachs and other companies have cut down their workforces significantly. Because of all of this, the Fed is meeting frequently to try to cool off this inflation problem. A principal way that the Fed does this, as I indicated about a minute ago, is to set the federal funds interest rate, which is the interest rate or the percentage that one has to pay to borrow money that big banks charge each other for overnight loans. Someone may say, if the Fed sets interest rates only among big banks, why does that matter for the rest of us? The answer is that the interest rate that banks charge one another ripples throughout the rest of the economy. Every other interest rate, whether it's credit card interest rates, the car loan rate, mortgages, not a mortgage that you already have, but if you're applying to get a mortgage, all of those borrowing rates go up or down by the same amount that the federal funds rate goes up or down. So the Fed wants to raise interest rates to make it more expensive for people to borrow money. Because when it's more expensive for people borrow less, and they tend to cut back their spending. And this depresses economic activity, it lowers demand, and it lowers the rate of increase of prices. This cools off inflation because inflation is when there's too much money sloshing around the economy for too few goods and services. So raising interest rates is quite an effective measure to combat inflation, but it comes at a great cost, which is higher unemployment. Because when company sales goes down, their stock price also goes down, and they start to look for ways to cut costs. And one of the easiest, most expedient ways to cut costs is to fire people, because the highest line item on most companies' balance sheets is compensation and benefits. In 2022, the Fed raised interest rates by 0.75% 4 consecutive times in a row. And in December of 2022, they stepped down to raising interest rates by 0.5% as opposed to 0.75%. But if you add that up, 0.75 times 4, that's 3%, plus the 0.5 makes it 3.5%. That's raising the interest rate by 3.5%, which is a huge rate of increase in just 1 year. Economists now are predicting that the Fed, in their meeting next week, will raise interest rates by 0.25%, which is good news that they are lowering the rate of increase from 0.75% to 5% to 0.25%, but still, 0.25% is still a considerable raise. And it means that in a year and a half, the Fed will have raised interest rates by 3.75%, which again is a lot, especially considering that in this century, there were years that went by where the rate was close to zero. In other, more riveting economic news, Microsoft has announced that it will invest billions of dollars into an artificial intelligence startup called OpenAI, which created the viral ChatGPT chatbot in November of 2022. ChatGPT is a service where you can type in a prompt such as, "Write a birthday card to my best friend," and it uses machine learning to find patterns in writing by humans to create human-sounding responses. This shows that Microsoft is trying to make inroads in artificial intelligence software, which many believe is the new iPhone, the new internet, the next new invention to change our world. According to Andy Kessler of the Wall Street Journal, in February of 2022, an online ticket fixer called Do Not Pay announced that it was using ChatGPT to coach someone to fight against a speeding ticket in an actual courtroom. They said that they would give the defendant an earpiece and have the chatbot speak in that person's ear and tell them what to say in front of a real-life judge. In fact, Do Not Pay also has offered $1 million to the first lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court who wears an earpiece with ChatGPT relaying to them their oral arguments. So it shows how this AI technology is in fact making inroads into our daily lives. This story about Microsoft's investment is interesting, of course, because it shows the speed of our technological advances. But it also raises interesting questions about responsibility. Microsoft will probably make a lot of money off of this investment. But is this really the direction that we want our society to go in? We already see how transactional, fake, and reduced our interactions are with one another with the advent of social media. But now, with this new technology, you can make things seem authentic, but they're actually just devised by a computer. Last night, I actually tried this chatbot to see what it was like, and I inputted 2 prompts. I'll read both of them to you. The first one, I asked them to please write an opening monologue for a talk show in the voice of Oprah. And within 1 minute, they did it. I'll read part of it. It says, "Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Oprah and I'm so excited to be here with you today. We have an incredible lineup of guests and topics." And then this next paragraph that they wrote is really creepy, again, because it's written by a computer. The chatbot said, "As human beings, we all crave connection. We want to feel seen, heard, and understood. And in a world that can sometimes feel so big and overwhelming, it can be easy to feel disconnected and alone." Okay, again, this is a robot. "But I want to remind you that we are not alone. We're in this together and we can make a difference. Thank you for being here and let's get started." So that was prompt number 1. And then I decided to see how serious the chatbot can get or how far it can go. So I asked it to please write a eulogy for a person who tragically drowned. And here's what they wrote. "We are gathered here today to say goodbye to a beloved member of our community. Name was a kind, caring, and compassionate person who touched the lives of so many." Okay, then this next part gets really weird. "Name loved the ocean and spent many happy hours swimming, surfing, and exploring the beauty of the sea. The ocean was a source of joy and peace for Name, and it is fitting that we say goodbye in its presence. However, this is not the way that we want to say goodbye to Naim, who was taken from us too soon and in such a tragic way. We are all devastated by the loss of Naim, who had so much life to give and love to give. But in the midst of our grief, we can find comfort in the memories. Let us take a moment to reflect on Naim's life. Rest in peace, dear Naim. You will always be in our hearts and forever missed. At a certain point, this stuff has to stop. Just because we can create technology like this doesn't mean that we should. Technology over the course of our history, as I will talk about later in the show, was built to make our lives functionally better and safer, to help us heat our homes properly, to help us transport ourselves properly from one place to another. But now we've conquered so many of these problems. So we are just in the stage of playing around and seeing how far technology can grow. And it's really scary to see the agency and the individuality and the worth of human beings become so rapidly replaced. Also, Apple is reportedly releasing new virtual reality headsets this spring. In December, we had John Moody on this show, who's the former executive vice president of Fox News, a journalist who has traveled all over the world, and he's an author of great historical fiction books about the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance state. One of the things that I learned from Mr. Moody is that China is investing in these virtual reality headsets produced by Apple and by other companies to try to control its population. And if you think about it, it's eerily brilliant, because if the CCP gives each of its citizens their own virtual reality headset, that person can, in another world, be free. They can be free to do whatever they want, to eat whatever they want, to travel wherever they want, to be whoever they want to be. But in reality, the CCP has control over that person wearing the headset. They will let people do whatever they want in a fake world as long as they have control over their bodies in the real world. So we have got to hold these executives' feet to the fire about the consequences of their dystopian investments. Finally, turning to international news. Last week, Israel's Supreme Court invalidated the ministerial appointment of Aryeh Deri, who was selected by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to serve in the Israeli government. The Supreme Court ordered that Mr. Deri's appointment, quote, cannot stand and is, quote, unreasonable because he previously pled guilty to criminal charges of tax fraud. However, people who oppose this decision by the Supreme Court argue that the Knesset, which is Israel's 120-seat parliamentary body, has a specific law that allows someone in Mr. Deri's position to still serve in the Israeli government. This Supreme Court ruling comes in the wake of judicial reforms proposed by Netanyahu's party that would take power away from the Supreme Court and give more of it to the Knesset. As it stands right now, the Supreme Court in Israel is one of the most powerful in the world. It has a lot of say over legislation and political appointments in the country. Here in the United States, our Supreme Court exercises, or is supposed to exercise, it's kind of debatable whether they've done that in the past half century, they're supposed to exercise judicial review, meaning that they can strike down laws only if those laws are unconstitutional. But Israel, unlike us, does not have a formally written constitution. So their Supreme Court, over time, has given itself the power to strike down any legislation passed by the Knesset. Not just legislation that breaks the law, but legislation that the Israeli Supreme Court may not like politically. The Israeli Supreme Court uses the standard of reasonableness, which says that it can rule on any issues in public life whenever it chooses, if that decision reasonably affects the government. But this standard of reasonableness, Netanyahu argues, is such an open-ended term, and the Israeli Supreme Court justices can define it however they want to rule on whatever they want. So Netanyahu has proposed eliminating this reasonableness standard as part of his proposed judicial reforms, so that the only time the court can strike down legislation is if it violates the law. And Netanyahu has also proposed to allow the Knesset, by a 61-vote majority, to suspend a Supreme Court nullification of a statute. Like the United States, Israel is quite divided between left and right politically. Much of the population loves Netanyahu, they call him Bibi affectionately, and they are very much in favor of his proposed judicial reforms. But another large segment of the Israeli population utterly despises him. In fact, last week, about 100,000 people took to the streets of Tel Aviv, the Israeli capital, in opposition to Netanyahu's proposed reforms. It seems like between this battle and the Temple Mount strife that I reported on 2 weeks ago, Israel, unfortunately, is going to see a lot more political clashes and violence. And as part of our timeless topic for today, I am going to discuss the use and disuse of certain words in America over time. And I discovered this database on Google. It's sort of interesting that I chose to report on it today, especially as I was talking to you about the dystopian chatbot. But this database is not dystopian, it actually is quite interesting and informative. Its link is books.google.com/ngrams. And it's a search engine that tracks the frequency of a word used in books over time. It scans the transcripts of hundreds of thousands of books published in English, Chinese, French, Hebrew, Italian, and other languages from the year 1500 to 2019. The word has to be found, though, in 40 or more books in that year in order to show up on a graph. So this database can teach you a lot about history. For instance, let's look up the word airplane. We can see that on the graph plotting English books from the year 1800 to 2019, the word doesn't consistently appear in books until 1913, which makes sense since the first successful airplane flight was in 1903 by the Wright brothers. The word was probably not used in 40 or more books until about 10 years after that event, so it makes total sense. Let's look up the word internet, see what it reveals here. It's the same thing with the word internet. You see there that it doesn't hit the graph until the 1980s. You can even learn not just about inventions through this database, but also when terms changed. For example, the word bagel doesn't show up on the graph in English-speaking books until the 1940s, even though the ring-shaped bread that we all know as a bagel was invented many years ago. The term apparently was not used until the 20th century, which is quite interesting. Anyway, today we're going to track words used in English books to describe, or words I should say, that describe values and emotions. But we're not going to do it from 1500 to 2019 since that's a large swath of time. But instead we're going to do it from 1800, just right after America's founding, to 2019, to see what it can reveal about changes in our thinking and behavior in the United States and in Western civilization. I love the famous quote, "Watch your thoughts for they become your words become your actions become your habits, and your habits become your character." That is so true. The language that we use quite literally speaks volumes about who we are, what we value, and how we behave. Throughout our history, most Americans commonly understood, certainly more than we do now, that there were certain character traits that we individually and we societally aspired to follow. This comes from our Judeo-Christian tradition. It was the first religious tradition in the world that had a unitary or one God who is perfectly just and moral, who says that we human beings are created in his image and in his likeness, and who reveals to us certain moral codes that he instructs us to follow. So the values that have characterized American life, like bravery, generosity, respect, self-improvement, Those have been revealed in the Noahide laws in the book of Genesis, the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus. If you're a Christian, the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament. And before the Judeo-Christian tradition, most religions were polytheistic, and each god had different standards or rules or conduct. And what's crucial to understand about this is that these gods could be happy and benevolent and just and caring, but they also mostly had the same malignant character traits as human beings, meaning that they could be violent, unjust, irrational, rash, bitter, resentful. So it's not necessarily that all virtues like kindness are uniquely Western religious inventions, but the idea, again, of a unitary God that sets universal, unchanging standards that every human must place higher than themselves, that every human being must follow, regardless if it personally or professionally advantages them, that is uniquely an invention of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Islam did adopt this structure later, but it wasn't established until centuries after Christianity and thousands of years after Judaism. So let's look up some of these virtues, starting with generosity. Yeah, you can see overall generosity has declined as being a word used in books. Let's look up courage and dignity. Dignity has declined a lot too, and courage, same thing. I love that word dignity. Do you ever hear that word being used anymore? It really, to me, encompasses the Judeo-Christian ethic that you hold yourself high as a human being through your conduct, through your speech, through the way that you dress, through the way that you handle setbacks and humiliation. If you look at people's Instagrams or social medias today, are we really a population that values dignity anymore? Let's look up kindness, respect, and duty. Some more virtues that we all used to agree we should aspire to live by. Yep, kindness has had a big trend downward. Respect also, well, that's interesting. Respect has had sort of a mixed bag. We can see it peaked there in about 1850. It's gone up slightly over the past few years, and then it's gone up a lot from 1980 to 2000. Okay, and then how about the word duty? I love that word too. To me, it's synonymous with selflessness. Yeah, duty's gone way down. And then let's look up modesty, gratitude, and wisdom. Modesty, way down from 1800. Gratitude, too. Slight trend upward since the year 2000, but mostly all down. And then let's see wisdom. Same thing with wisdom. Mostly downward, but then with a slight trend up in the last few years. You notice that with each of these virtues, the graph went down most significantly around the 1820s to the 1880s. Let's even look up the word virtue itself and see if it followed a similar thing. Yep, you see right there, went down right in that same period. The 19th century is that key period. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, where the steam engine became widely used, where factories were popping up all over the country. It's when America started to shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial manufacturing economy. This brought us, I should say, great prosperity, but it also facilitated a lot of changes to our daily lives and culture that we haven't been able to get back. And this is because a lot of people started to work for big organizations, which they hadn't done before. It wasn't really common to work for a big organization at that time unless you worked for the Army or for the United States government. But in the early 1800s, people started moving away from their towns, away from the places where they grew up, to work in factories that were overwhelmingly concentrated in big cities, and usually concentrated near navigable waterways such as oceans, lakes, and rivers, so that steamboats could carry supplies to a factory nearby. But this means that people were increasingly becoming disconnected from their traditions and their roots. They were being taken away from, again, their hometowns, their churches, their families, their communities that they always knew and that helped reinforce these values. Let's look up the words beauty and magnificence next. Beauty too, wow, has had a big trend downwards. And then magnificence has had an exponential trend downwards too. And again, you see that 1820 to 1880 is that key period. Let's also look up art, hope, and imagination. Art, okay, art has been pretty stable, somewhat of a trend downward, but I would say that looks pretty linear. The word hope, let's see here, pretty big trend downward, come up a little bit in the past year, but certainly not at the level that it was in the year 1800. And then imagination, same thing. Wow. You know, I chose these 5 words because to me, they describe the grand parts of life, the things that make life a transcendent and meaningful experience that go beyond what job you have or what college you went to or how much money you make or how many square feet your house is. When was the last time, for instance, that we heard someone in our modern society describe something as magnificent? If you think about that word, it can only really aptly be applied to a performance or a painting or a poem or, again, something transcendent. You can't use the word magnificent to describe a graduation ceremony or a promotion at your job. So it's not a shock that as we have become more materially prosperous, we seem to have less regard for these transcendent, meaningful parts of life and the words that reflect them. And you know, another thing to note is that Western society hasn't just become more materially prosperous. We have improved our quality of life in many other significant ways since the year 1800. Let's look up the word death and see how much it's been used over the past 200 years in books. Again, trend downward. God knows there's still a lot of death going on, and that will always be a problem. But if you go back 200 years, it was pretty common to have a child die. So we've really eradicated some of those harsher causes of death and problems in life. Next, let's look up the word famine. Oh, that's quite interesting. You see the graph, again, trend downward, but kind of reach high points at different decades. We see here that it reached a high point in the 1840s. Well, I think that was during the time of the Irish potato famine. The only reason why I know this is because I am 50% Irish, so out of allegiance to my people, I need to have those dates seared into my memory. It's actually when my ancestors came across the pond to the United States, so that makes sense why it peaked in books during that time. It looks like it also peaked in the 1870s. I believe there was a famine in India during that time. I know that because, as some of you know, I recently did a history of India on the show. There's an episode called India 101 if you want to look at it. But under British rule, there was a famine in the late 19th century in India. And then it seems also the word famine to have upticked after World War II. And we know that in the early 1930s, there was a massive man-made famine in Ukraine called Holodomor. It's spelled Holodomor. It was, again, man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine that killed millions of people. Actually, this year, 2023, marks the 90 years since this event. So I'm actually going to do a show on this in the upcoming weeks. And then finally, let's look up the word war, because I'm trying to prove a point here. Okay, this is sort of expected. We can see that the word has peaked around World War I, then peaked again around World War II. But overall, in English books, over the past 200 years, it has been a trend downwards as far as the use of this word. And so it makes sense that death, famine, and war overall have trended downward in use because we Westerners are privileged enough to have not had experienced these things on a large scale. So let's search, let's search the word boredom. Look at that. Look at how much that has grown. Wasn't used at all, it seems, in books from 1800 to 1840. Then it started picking up pace. But wow, the most exponential growth of that word occurred between 1980 and 2000. That's the advent of the internet. Okay, let's look up the word tired. Same thing. Trend upwards, but especially an exponential trend around 1980 to 2000. And then also the word lazy. Isn't that revealing? As we have more resources, more access to information, we are talking about boredom more, which probably means that we are a lot more bored. The leisure that our modern society enjoys is such a double-edged sword because in some ways, obviously, we want a lot of leisure, but it also seems to not fulfill us. Perhaps the biggest development in the past 150 years that has made our leisurely life possible, and you should tell this to environmentalists who should put this in their pipe and smoke it, is the advent of fossil fuels. Those started to be used around the year 1900, and before fossil fuels, people relied on whale oil. What the heck is that, by the way? Whale oil. None of us know because we don't have to use it as much anymore. And coal and wood in order to cook and heat their homes. And it required so much heavy lifting, so much heavy work just to survive. But now that so many of these things are taken care of, it's a good thing, but we seem to emotionally be worse off as a result of it. So we're going to now look up some more specific emotions. Let's start with pain. Well, pain it stayed stable from about 1800 to 1880, then trended downward, then sort of stayed stable, and it has gone way, way, way up, starting in about the 1970s. And it right now is at a higher level than it was in 1800. Let's look up sadness. So, almost identical. Pretty much, well, it seemed to have gone up in the 19th century, but then it trended downward and then huge exponential growth in recent decades. How about, on the other hand, happiness? Wow. Graph almost exclusively going down from the year 1800 to 2019. How about, in general, the word emotion? So the word emotion has gone way up in its use. So it seems that we're talking a lot about emotion, but the specific emotions that we are discussing are negative or unpleasant ones as opposed to positive ones. Let's look up anger and the word annoying. Anger, big uptick in the 20th century, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. The word annoying, let's see. Similar thing. Gosh, it's so interesting. Most of these emotions, they've trended downward and then gone way, way up. How about self? Self has been almost a consistent line upward. Okay, these next few words, you're going to be a little bit confused why I'm wanting to type them in, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Let's look up the word eat, drink, smoke, and toilet. Okay, so start with eat. Wasn't used that much, it seems. The graph stayed kind of consistent, has gone way up. Okay. Are we eating more? Are we talking about eating more? Who knows, but we're writing about it more clearly. Then the word drink has had a similar thing. We've been talking a lot more about drinking in the past few decades. Smoke. Smoke, not as much, hasn't had as dramatic of an increase, but still a pretty big one. And then the word toilet. Yeah, toilet has increased a lot over the past few decades. What these trends show is that we are concerned with the material, physical, negative, and even it seems sort of tawdry parts of life. And above all else, we seem to be concerned more with ourselves, how things are going for me. Before, in the United States, people tended to think of themselves more as part of a common society that was trying to accomplish something, or at least had certain rules and standards that all of us had to obey. But now there seems to be this trend of such narcissism in the words that we use. Let's look up sensitive as a word. I bet that's had a huge uptick, my gosh. Okay, well, it's gone down, it seems, a little bit over the past few decades, but overall the trend is upwards. And then let's look up the word entitlement. Okay, that's very interesting. It's gone up and then it's gone down. How about want? Okay, want has gone way up. And uncomfortable. Exponential growth there. Uncomfortable, my gosh, are we really using that word more? The thing that is so sad now is that we seem to have flattened ourselves as people. We don't focus as much anymore on elevating ourselves by shaping our character. If you look at the virtues that I started this segment out with, dignity, respect, duty, courage, each of those things are so ennobling in different but related ways. And if you focus on each of those qualities, of building those up in yourself, you can shape yourself into such a remarkable and full human being. It's like adding different color palettes to a canvas instead of just painting in shades of black, gray, and white. We are so bowing down on our potential as human beings by being so selfish and abandoning the quest for these noble qualities and good behavior. And finally, as part of this segment, we have got to look up some of these new fads, like the word gender. It's crazy that I'm even calling the word gender a fad. Gender should just be gender, but we can see here, really wasn't talked about from 1800 to the 1970s, and then right after the 60s, predictably, it's gone way up. How about the word race? That's quite interesting. Race has stayed pretty stable compared to these other words. How about racism? Yeah, that makes sense. Up, up, up after the 1940s. Now look, obviously, that was during the time of Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 1964, so it does make sense why people were writing and talking more about racism in the latter half of the 20th century. But look at how much it has gone up since then in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. How about misogyny? That is kind of a hard word to spell. M-I-S-O-G-Y-N-Y. Yeah, misogyny has gone up. As our society has become less misogynistic, the word has gone up. Let's look at equity. That's pretty shocking. Equity has stayed, it's kind of gone all over the place, but it's gone down. Well, one important thing to note, and I've forgotten to tell you this or remind you of it, this database only goes until the year 2019. So if you think about all that has happened since the killing of George Floyd in 2020, it sort of makes sense why the word equity hasn't gone up as much as one might expect. I can promise you or bet you that when this Google database updates its books to go through 2020, 2021, and 2022, the word equity will skyrocket. Let's look up defund the police. Can't find it. Oh my gosh. Remember the day when that craziness was not in our lexicon? Again, we will see the graph go way up when they update this. How about January 6th? Let's look up January 6th. Huh. Why is that? Look at that. The word or the term January 6th peaked in the 1930s and 40s. We should figure out why that is. Was there something that happened on January 6th during that time? Perhaps. Again, we're going to see that graph change. Let's look up homophobia and transphobia. Oh my gosh, look at that, homophobia. Never used until the 70s, and then huge trend upwards. Transphobia started, wow, in the 2000s. And look at that, it's just a straight line basically upwards since the year 2000. How about the word victimization? Yep, started after the 60s. And finally, let's do a few more lefty words. How about the word narrative? Gosh, look at that. Gone way down from 1800 and 1920, then gone way up. How about find yourself? That's one of their favorite ones. Find yourself. Yep, almost a straight line up since the 80s. How about your truth? Oh my God. Yeah. Since about 1990, also a straight line upward. How about speak truth to power, queen? That's what they always say. Speak truth to power. Okay, same thing. And finally, because we looked up the word war, let's look up the word fight. Isn't that interesting? We see the word fight peak during the Civil War, and then peak during World War I, and then peak during World War II, but then go way exponentially upwards when we don't have a war. It's gone way upwards from 1980 onward because now we're fighting against, bigotry, racism, homophobia, transphobia. The word fight has gone way up as the word war has gone down. What's interesting about these things that people are fighting nowadays, again, I just mentioned racism, sexism, misogyny. I had this observation in college and it kind of hit me like a lightning bolt. Most people who are quote unquote fighting against these things have never in their lives seen them before. I'm certainly not saying that racism or sexism doesn't exist, and I'm not saying that every single person hasn't experienced them. But the average college student who says that it's their crusade to fight against racism, I can promise you has really almost never experienced racism a day in their lives. Or even people who say that they are fighting against climate change. When have they ever actually experienced the day-to-day effects of climate change? And isn't it just a creepy thing that we have large swaths of people who are making it their lives vocation, who are writing dissertations and books, and again, devoting their whole livelihood to fighting against these things that they have never seen before? It's just odd. So what all of this shows, all of these words that we've plotted, what they indicate is that we have become a materially abundant but a spiritually and emotionally impoverished society. But that doesn't have to be true. I am not arguing that material abundance necessarily leads to this spiritual or emotional impoverishment, but it does very easily creep up on us if we don't keep these eternal values in mind. So it is incumbent upon all of us to not forget them and to continue to strive to live by them as best as we can. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you tomorrow. Take care.